Comparisons between Dune and Star Wars have been around for a long time. This topic comes up quite often in both fandoms. You can see Dune-inspired elements in George Lucas's Star Wars, so those comparisons have always kind of been there among fans to see that and can appreciate those elements of inspiration in Star Wars. But they are so different from each other, the Dune universe and Star Wars. So they have these elements that are similar, but vastly different from each other, and the themes too, that are really at the core of each IP. But it's interesting to hear what Denis Villeneuve has to say on this, get his opinion on the comparisons there between Star Wars and Dune. And this is comments about specifically the characters of Luke Skywalker, Anakin Skywalker, and Paul Atreides, and comparing those things. This is an article from Fandom Wire. The interview was actually with Jake's Takes, and I think he has a YouTube channel, so this video is out there as well. This kind of breaks up the interview in little subjects. So this portion of the interview, it talked about comparing Timothée Chalamet's role to a certain Star Wars character. So the article says, apparently during the interview, Denis Villeneuve was asked if he believes that moviegoers have understood who Paul Atreides truly is and realized his motives. Denis Villeneuve claimed to hope for fans to realize that Timothée Chalamet's character is an anti-hero, later comparing him with Anakin Skywalker, one of the most debated and polarizing Star Wars characters. Villeneuve offered a better perspective. So it's an interesting question because I know that that was important to the director, Denis Villeneuve. He really wanted to establish the core theme surrounding Paul Atreides, and that did influence certain narrative changes. As we see with the character of Chani, she was supposed to be that window for the audience to see Paul's transformation. The article continues, while Denis Villeneuve was hailed for his iconic adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune novels based on the cinematography, casting, and set design, he was quick to realize that people might not realize the truth behind Timothée Chalamet's character. Especially the ones who haven't read the books are far from understanding the motives behind Chalamet's Paul Atreides. This is Denis Villeneuve's perspective. So when he was asked on Jake's Takes the truth behind Timothée Chalamet's character, Paul Atreides, he explains how Paul Atreides is actually an anti-hero that people often root for. Villeneuve even compared the character to a Star Wars role. In an attempt to simplify his explanation, the director mentioned that Paul is much like Anakin Skywalker. He says, quote, I hope so. People are understanding the way Paul was meant to be understood. The idea was to create a distance with Paul, and that to understand that he took the wrong door, and so that the movie would be a cautionary tale against messianic figure. This is his interpretation. This is how he sees this story. But I do disagree with how he views Paul's choices, in that by saying that he took a wrong door, he's also implying that there was a right one. And there really wasn't. There was no good decisions here. It's literally the best of the worst options were before him. As Paul's powers of prescience are beginning to awaken, he can see the future, and we saw that in Dune Part 1 teased. We see the Fremen legions going to war in his name in the shrine to his father's skull. In the book, he sees that several times. He sees the Jihad and he's trying to avoid it. He's like, this must not happen. Sometimes he would say something a little different in his head to see if anything would change the future. And no, it didn't. Nothing he did would have mattered. The Jihad would still have happened. Even if he were to have died, it still would have happened. The death and destruction would have been even worse because he would have been martyred, and it would have just made the Fremen legions that much more fervent in their holy war. That's the issue I take with how he sees that there is no right decision. And it speaks to how different Dune and Star Wars are. Star Wars is your classic tale of good versus evil. It's very much that traditional hero's journey. Dune is much more grounded in realism when it comes to its themes surrounding the commercial elements, political, religious themes, ecology. Paul Atreides, that figure, was based on real historical figures like JFK, like these ones that really inspire a lot of loyalty and people's affection. That's what was the intent in that first book, to create a leader that you could root for, that came to power not through any corrupt or bad reasons, but when the power comes to him, he makes decisions and mistakes. Those mistakes can be amplified by the sheer number who follow blindly now, that become so enamored in figures like these. Whereas George Lucas's Star Wars is definitely more classic good versus evil, mythology. In Dune, there's maybe like a few characters that are definitely wholly evil, but there's a lot of protagonists that are hard to view as wholly good either. It's definitely more complicated. So it's interesting how this theme was presented in the movie, and these movies are definitely a very streamlined vision of Frank Herbert's very complex theme. I think there are elements in there that do speak true to Frank Herbert's intent, because we do see him in Dune Part 2 being pushed to go south, which he doesn't want to do because he knows that the Southern fundamentalists would spearhead or trigger the events in motion that would lead to this jihad that would rage across the universe. He could see it. But everyone around him, his closest confidants, are pushing him to embrace the Messiah figure, to embrace the power. He's fighting against it. So that actually speaks true to the book. I do wonder if general audiences are getting his particular vision and intent with this character. In his mind, he thought that the character of Chani, the changes that he made, was kind of like they'll look at her and see the truth of the matter and see how this is going to go. I don't know if that really came across though, because I still think that a lot of people saw him as a hero. And honestly, they should, because that was the original author's intent, was to have this particular story, the first book, Dune, be the one that props up the hero. And the rest of the story, as it plays out with Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, as the dismantling of that. That's exactly how he wanted that story to go. I think it's fine to even foreshadow it, because that's how Frank Herbert laid the groundwork for it. He planted the seeds of what was going to happen in the future, that it wasn't going to be sunshine and rainbows, that this wasn't going to have a happy ending. And I think the films put some of that in there. I think almost immediately when he first met up with the Fremen, he's still seeing it. He's still seeing the Jihad, and after he defeated Jameis, I think it sealed it. I think it was that moment of him defeating Jameis that it didn't matter. Even if he would have died or will die in the future, the Jihad would still happen. I think he said that his mother and sister would still go on, and that would be enough for the Fremen legions to go and to have even more death and destruction because of his martyred status. And yeah, again, that is how I think the movie actually turns out, because this is the story that you're working with. This is what's in the source material. And in the source material, you have this figure who was bred to be the Kwisatz Haderach. He had no choice in that. As his powers are awakening, all of these events are happening by these corrupt institutions that ushered in the downfall of his house, the death of his father. You can't help but root for that individual to seek vengeance for his father, who was a good man, and also the Fremen to a point too, because they, under Harkonnen rule, very oppressive, and they were hunted for sport. I think actually the films speak more towards the source material's original story. I know that he wanted Chani to be that window into Paul's soul for the audience to see it, and maybe it did to a point, but I think by and large, audiences still saw Paul as a hero, as a heroic figure. But Denis Villeneuve continues, no one can watch the movie thinking that Paul is a triumph at the end. One of the good Dune adaptations was Star Wars, and Paul is absolutely much closer to Anakin than Luke Skywalker. I think that that's very debatable, because who is he getting victory over? The Bene Gesserit, specifically how it works out with Arrakis, the religious manipulation there, and the corrupt emperor wanting to get rid of Duke Leto, a good man, a just man. And the Harkonnens were just straight up evil, consumed by greed, ambition, lust for power at any cost. They will do whatever it takes to achieve their goals and backstab each other if they have to along the way. And these were the ones that Paul was rising up against to defeat. So that is a triumph. But again, I think it is more complicated than that. What does the triumph really mean? All these elements are in place, spies still exist, the Imperium still exists. He's just taking control of it. But after that, once the power comes to Paul Atreides, that's when the theme continues. What happens as a result of Paul's ultimate control? But when it comes to the comparison, Denis Villeneuve is saying that Paul Atreides is more like Anakin Skywalker. On paper, I see the similar elements. You can't help but see George Lucas's inspiration, because both of these figures, Paul Atreides and Anakin Skywalker, were both bred specifically to be very powerful people. So Anakin was conceived by the Force, so very powerful with the Force. And of course, Paul Atreides was bred with these genetic traits to be the Kwisatz Haderach, one that was like Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother, Space and Guild Navigator, and Mentat combined that could see past, present, and future. And you can see the similarities in how their relationships, Paul and Chani, and Anakin and Padme, how it works out for both Padme and Chani, the tragedy in their deaths and giving birth to twins. Similar elements there, but so wholly different in their character arcs. And honestly, I feel like Paul Atreides evokes both. In the first book, you can compare Paul to Luke Skywalker. It's not the traditional hero's journey, and it's not as triumphant as those stories would be at the end of good versus evil. Then I guess it could be both, as Dune Messiah works out, more akin to Anakin Skywalker. Well, it's interesting too because it says Villeneuve mentioned making the mistake of previously believing that Paul was more similar to Luke Skywalker than Anakin. The director admitted to changing his perspective over time. So it seems that by the end of the Dune trilogy, fans and moviegoers might finally realize that Timothée Chalamet's Paul Atreides is more of an anti-hero than the Messiah he's being hailed as. Although a bit of it was hinted at in the sequel following his changing behavior towards Zendaya's Chani, Denis Villeneuve believes that people will soon realize the depth of Paul's character, but will find it difficult to hate him, much like Anakin. While in Star Wars, Anakin Skywalker's transition into the dark side, leading him to get corrupted and rationalize destroying the Jedi Order, made him a hateful character, his role in Clone Wars was hailed for his childlike innocence, sense of adventure, innovation, and curiosity. Anakin Skywalker, on the one hand, portrayed how power can corrupt even the best. On the other hand, it showcased his cool, rule-breaking side that people thrive for. At the end of the day, Anakin remained one of the most important yet polarizing characters in the Star Wars franchise, and perhaps by the end of the Dune trilogy, Timothée Chalamet's Paul Atreides will transform into someone like Anakin, who will not only become a cautionary tale, but also an idol for his bold moves and focus towards his goal. I struggle to even use the terms hero and anti-hero. It's definitely more complex than that, and that ultimately is the biggest difference between Star Wars and Dune. Star Wars is just much more in that fantasy fairy tales, almost. That is what George Lucas mostly leaned on. He loved those Buck Rogers serials. He loved that sense of adventure. But Dune is a warning. It's not just a warning about someone being in a position of power that corrupts that person. Paul's decisions invoke empathy from people, because even in the films, he doesn't want to go south. He doesn't want the jihad to happen. He wants to live his life as a Fedaykin with Chani, and he doesn't want anything more than that. But he is pushed. He's pushed by Stilgar, he's pushed by Gurney Halleck to accept the mantle and the power and influence that the Mahdi figure can give him. Lady Jessica was full on trying to pave the way for the Fremen's acceptance of him as the Messiah. So she was much more of a figure that was full on involved in their manipulation to accept him. All of these forces, destiny had utter control. His fate was decided long ago. Only choice that he has is to mitigate the damage and try to mitigate the damage to his loved ones. That's much more focused on in Dune Messiah. I think that he's trying to spare the ones he loves from the most heartache. It's still all bad. All the pathways are not good. So yeah, there's definitely so much more. And if you were to streamline it down to its most basic elements, then yes, you can see the comparisons obviously between Dune and Star Wars. But there's so much depth and layers to Frank Herbert's Dune, but that's honestly going to be the case when you compare stories that are told in books to those that are told in visual mediums. But that being said, even though Villeneuve makes a few observations about Paul's character arc that I don't really agree with, I think his films did a decent job at portraying Paul's journey, and whether it be intentional or not, there's a lot of aspects to this adaptation that I think resonate with those nuances of the character in the book. But I'm curious to know what you think of Villeneuve's comments about Paul's role in the Dune saga. Do you think it's accurate to say that he mirrors the character arc of Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe for more Dune and other sci-fi and fantasy news and lore. And if you're looking for other ways to show your appreciation, you can check out my Patreon page, where members get access to exclusive content and perks. Thank you all so much for your support, and as always, have a very nerdy day.